Abomination of Desolation. What is it? Has it come already? Is it coming in some appointed time? Do they have to make a red heifer and a third temple be built and then Abomination of Desolation come? Or has it already come? And what are the heavens and the earth? When Jesus said, heaven and earth shall not pass away, or one jot or one tittle shall not pass away until heaven and earth shall pass away. What is the heaven and earth he was talking about? We're going to figure this out. And I've been studying this for the past probably about 7-8 months now. I actually talked with a Hebrew Israelite brother, or so-called, I don't know. But we had a long dialogue, and I had no clue what it was. I didn't know what the Abomination of Desolation was. I'd heard of it, but I wasn't sure. I just didn't know. But talking with him and praying and doing my own study, God led me to what it actually is. Listening to other points of views, reading the scripture. And really, when you read the scriptures that's in front of you, a lot of times God gonna lead you to the truth. So, what is it? Now, again, I've never really known what it was, but I had some kind of idea about end time prophecy and all this kind of stuff, and the mark of the beast and 666 and Great Tribulation, but I wasn't exactly sure. Well, his perspective, the Hebrew Israelite perspective, or I guess what you would call maybe the post-millennium perspective, I suppose, one of those millennium perspectives, they are wrong. And what I'm going to show you is, I'm going to show you what the heavens and earth that shall pass away are, and I'm going to show you that the Abomination of Desolation has already happened. I'm going to tell you up front, he's already set in the temple, he's already set in the holy place, and the heavens and earth are not the physical heavens and earth that we stand on today. The heavens and earth is referencing something else, and I'm going to tell you that at the end. And I'm going to show you unequivocal proof that the Abomination of Desolation has already happened. But first, what I want to share with you is the language. Example. You always got to do language, keep language in context. If I said, I'm about to go to the trap house with my Millie and hit the block, you would understand what I meant. But if I wrote a letter to you and said, I'm about to go to the trap house with my 9 Millie and hit the block, and somebody 2,000 years from now read that letter, they would be clueless as to what that meant. They wouldn't know what a trap house was, probably wouldn't know what a 9 Millie was, and probably wouldn't have a clue what it meant to hit the block. Same scenario in Matthew 24, and I'm finding out in the Bible in general. Language is something that you got to keep in context. When Jesus used language like he's coming in the clouds and the heaven and earth shall pass away, this is language that Israelites understood because he used it all the time in the Old Testament. Example, when the Bible says God is coming out of heaven, or he's coming in the clouds with great glory, in Matthew 24 in Abomination Desolation, he's not talking about him physically, a physical appearance of Christ coming in the clouds. Not in Matthew 24. The day of the Lord and the coming of the Lord happened more than once in the Old Testament. Several different times, God exacted judgment on people and on nations and on kings using the same language. I'll give you a couple examples. Isaiah chapter 34. Read Isaiah chapter 34, verse 1 through about 6. Isaiah chapter 34 is talking about judgment on Edom. And he used similar language. He talked about the heavens are going to shake, the Sky is going to be rolled back like a scroll. He said the rivers were going to burn like pitch. The lands was going to burn like pitch forever throughout all their generations, and used a whole bunch of what you would call, or what maybe writers would call, mythopoetic language, or what Bible students would call apocalyptic language. He used all kind of apocalyptic language, all kind of incredible, grandiose language, talking about judging Edom, but none of the stuff he said about the earth burning like a pitch forever and the seas burning like fire forever happened. But Edom was judged. They were destroyed. Another example, read the book of Psalms, chapter 18. Read 1 through about 17, or 4 through 17. Psalms chapter 18, verses 4 through 17. And a parallel passage is 2 Psalms chapter 22. You can read that whole chapter. This is about David asking God to deliver him from Saul, because Saul, you know the story of Saul and David. Well, in chapter 18, verse 4 through about 11, God used all kind of incredible language again. Go read it for yourself. I'm not going to read everything that was in it, but go look at it. Psalms 18, chapter 4 through 11. All kind of incredible language. And in verse 9, David said that God was going to come out of heaven. But none of what he said happened. But David was delivered from Saul. So, and that's just a couple examples. If you email me, I'll send you a whole list of examples, whole list of Old Testament Bible stories that illustrate this kind of language, and the stuff that is illustrated never happened, but nations and kings and people were always judged. And several times it was Israel. So let's keep the language in context when we're reading Matthew chapter 24 and talking about the Abomination Desolation. So I'll start at Matthew chapter 23 actually, because this is kind of where it starts at. So, but what I'll tell you first is the coming of the Lord in Matthew 24. He's coming back to judge Israel. This is not second coming. This is Christ coming back to judge Israel, and not him coming back physically, but God sending a nation to judge Israel. This is what Matthew 24, coming of the Lord, is. And I'm going to show that to you. But Matthew 23 is where it all started. You can start, and I got some notes down here. You can start at the very beginning, actually, all the way from the top to the bottom. He called the Pharisees and scribes, he called them hypocrites, he called them vipers, called them a generation of vipers. And keep in mind that word generation. He called them serpents. He said they shall crucify. They had killed prophets. They had killed Zechariah. They had killed John the Baptist. He said they are going to kill more prophets and crucify more prophets. I believe you can even add Christ in there. And in verse 38, he was just tearing them up from verse 1 all the way to 37. And in verse 38, he says, he was telling them, well, before verse 38, verse 35, he says that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto Zacharias. So he said, all the blood that you spilled, out of all the prophets I sent you, all the righteous blood, you will be judged for it. This is before the Abomination Desolation conversation. He's telling them that they're going to be judged for all the things that they've done throughout the years. And in verse 38, he says, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. This is where it all starts. So now Matthew chapter 24. This is where the conversation starts to get going. And in verse number 2, verse number 1, the disciples were showing him the temple. And verse number 1 says, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. Verse 2. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. If you and I were to read that, we would think simply that the temple was going to be destroyed. And we would be correct. But there's a lot more than just temple destruction. Most people who aren't familiar with the Bible probably wouldn't understand, but those familiar with the Bible would, and the disciples understood exactly what that meant. That didn't mean just the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. That meant judgment on Israel and the end of Israel. This is what this meant. Verse 3, the disciples asked him. They came to him privately saying, they asked him two things. They said, tell us, when shall these things be? ? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? ? I used to separate those questions. I used to say that's three different questions, and they could all happen in three different time frames. Upon further study, I've realized that they are different questions, but they're all related, and it's all happening in the same time frame. So I'll read the questions again. When shall these things be? What things? What he said in verse 2, that the temple would be destroyed, the buildings. When shall that happen? And when shall the sign of thy coming be and the end of the world? Now, the sign of thy coming, again, is not talking about second coming. And I'm going to prove that to you in a minute. And end of the world is not talking about the world we stand on. It's not talking about the physical world. It's not talking about the cosmos. Well, how do I know it's not talking about the cosmos? Because the word in Greek for the physical world is cosmos. Look the word up in the Greek dictionary. Go to biblos.com, biblos.com. Put in their search bar Matthew 24 verse 3. When it comes up, click the Greek tab. The Greek tab is going to pull up the Greek of Matthew 24 verse 3 on one side and the English on the other side. Go all the way down to the bottom and look at the word world. What you will not see is cosmos. But what you will see is a different word. And that word is ainos. What does ainos mean? It means generations. That is not the physical world. That's a generation. That's centuries or an age. So what the disciples was asking him was, when is this temple going to be destroyed? When are you coming? And when is the end of this, our generation, our age? The disciples understood that when Christ said the temple is going to be destroyed, the temple represented Israel and Judaism. So the destruction of the temple, prophesied by Christ, represented the destruction of Israel as a nation and the destruction of their system, Torah, Judaism. And I'm going to show you that in a second. The temple represented everything they stood for. And they knew that when the temple was destroyed, prophesied by Christ, that it was the end of Israel as they knew it. So let's go down to verse 14. What I'm telling you is this has already happened. Okay? The temple already was destroyed. He already returned to judge Israel. Not him physically, but he came in the form of a nation judging another nation. And the end of the world already happened. What trips a lot of people up on this is, and again, just read all that whole chapter and keep in mind language context, okay? What trips a lot of people up on this, and what used to trip me up, is verse 14. Verse 14 says, and he's given signs of what's going to happen. Going to be wars and rumors of wars, nations going to rise up against nations, kingdom against kingdom, a whole bunch of different stuff. And 14 says, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. The end of what? The end of Israel, Torah, Judaism. Well, some people say, well, the gospel had been preached throughout all the world. First of all, you don't know that. Secondly, he was talking about at that time. The gospel needed to be preached throughout all the world before this prophecy could happen. The gospel had to be preached throughout all the world at that time. Did it happen at that time? Yes, it did. Do you remember Acts chapter 2? Acts chapter 2, when the first gospel sermon was preached, the Holy Spirit says there were, on the day of Pentecost, there were Jews and devout men out of every nation under heaven. Remember what Christ told the apostles right before he went back to glory in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18? He says, go and teach and baptize all nations, making disciples of all nations. Acts chapter 2, verse 4. There were devout men, there were Jews and devout men out of every nation under heaven. The gospel had been preached to every nation. Why do you think Paul, when he was having problems with the Jews wanting to circumcise Titus, and he went on and did it anyway, not because it was law, but because he said so that the gospel could continue, because he understood that he had to get the gospel to all nations. So chapter 14 was fulfilled. The gospel got preached to all nations. Something else that trips people up. Well, something else that should give you indication that this happened in their time, not ours, not something that's coming. Verse 15, he says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee in the mountains. He was talking to them. Let them that be in Judea. He wasn't talking to us. He was talking to them. He said, let those of you who I'm talking to that are in Judea flee into the mountains. This is something that was going to happen in their lifetime. Now, I know that some folks, and I've talked with some of you guys personally, some Hebrew Israelites personally, and we've had conversations about this on the phone. And what they say is, well, when the time comes, when they make a red heifer and a third temple is built in Jerusalem, we are going to have to go to Jerusalem. And then when the Abomination of Desolation sits in the holy place, we will have to flee into the mountains. Man, that is foolishness. This brother told me that when they make the red heifer and the third temple is built, we got 1,260 days or some number like that. Time times a half a time. 1,260 some days before Christ comes to the T. Now, that's an indication right there. Whenever somebody tell you exactly when Christ's coming back, you ought to know you might be in a cult. You ought to know that something ain't right. You ought to know that that person does not know what they're talking about. Christ told you even in this passage. He said, if any man tell you, as a matter of fact, let me go read it. Christ said in verse 23, he said, then if any man shall say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets. And he goes on to tell you in a later verse, no man knows the day or the hour, not the Son, not angels, only the Father. So how can anybody tell you that it's 1,260 days to the T when some red heifer and a third temple is built? When furthermore, Christ said these things are going to happen. The disciples asked him, when is this temple going to be destroyed? Not a third temple, this temple. Now, I know somebody going to run to Revelation and get some passage where he took out a ruler and measured some stuff and say, see, that's the third temple. That's I know they're gonna do it. But see, what's happening is somebody is deciding to hold on to what they've been taught as opposed to what the scriptures teach. And that's unfortunate. Because Christ said, see these buildings, one stone will not be left upon another on these buildings, the buildings Christ was looking at. He didn't mention the third temple. And the apostles asked him, when are these buildings going to be destroyed? So question, is the temple destroyed? It's destroyed. It's already destroyed. So this third temple business is foolishness. Even if they build a third temple, Christ mentioned that temple. Unless Christ didn't know what he was talking about, the third temple is irrelevant. Okay? But let's go further. Something else that trips people up about this not happening in their time, but a time to come. Verse 21. For then shall be great tribulation, such was not since the beginning of the world, to this time, nor ever shall be. That's the great tribulation. So people say, this couldn't have happened in their time because the great tribulation hadn't come yet. Well, let's just keep reading. Read verse. Well, I'll go down to verse 29. Well, verse 29 through about 30. About 31. This is something else that trips people up. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken, etc., etc., etc. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, etc., etc., etc. And they say, see, that couldn't have happened already, because none of that stuff happened. Well, I got news for you. None of that stuff is going to happen. When Christ was talking, keep in mind language context. He was talking in a apocalyptic language style that Jews would understand. He's done it many times in the Old Testament. I already gave you a couple examples. It's tons and tons of more examples where Christ spoke just like this. And the things he said never happened, but the nation he was talking about was destroyed by another nation, and many times it was Israel. This is talking about judgment on a nation. When he's talking about the heavens will be shaken and the moon will not give its light, he's talking about rulers, nations, and kings. And in this passage, he's talking about the nation of Israel. Verse 34. This is about it. How do we know that this has already happened? Aside from all the stuff we just covered. Verse 34. Well, I'll start with verse 33. So likewise, this is still Christ talking. So likewise, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verse 34, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. I'm going to read verse 34 again. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. This generation. What generation? That one. That generation. So unless there are, this was over 2,000 years ago when this happened. So unless there are some 2,000-year-old men or women still alive today, that generation has passed. And if that generation has passed, Christ said that all these things will be fulfilled. What things? From verse 3 to verse 33. The Abomination of Desolation, sitting in the holy place, the Great Tribulation, the destruction of the temple. They all happened in that generation. So when did they happen? It happened in AD 70. AD 70 was the destruction of Jerusalem. Google Book of Wars, Josephus, the historian, and you'll see excerpts from Josephus documenting the Jerusalem war when Israel, the nation of Israel, was encamped by the Roman army. And during that time, the stuff that's documented in the Book of Wars was horrific, and most of it was prophesied in the Old Testament. During their encampment, when Rome had Israel surrounded, Jerusalem surrounded, during that very time, in AD 70, Jews were fighting against each other inside Jerusalem while they were encamped by Rome. It had gotten so bad, and it became such a terrible place to be, that the Jews would put bread in the oven, dough in the oven, and before it could even cook, they would take it out and eat it because they didn't want the smell to get out to their neighbors because nobody had any food. It was a famine. It had gotten so bad that Jewish women and men, and this is all in the book of Josephus, started to eat their own children. That's how bad it got. They had turned to cannibals. This is prophesied in the Old Testament, that they would eat their own children during this judgment. This is how bad it got. They totally obliterated Israel. So the Abomination of Desolation was the Roman general at the time. And this is in the Book of Wars. He sat in the holy place. He sat in the temple. He called himself God. Not only that, he put idols in the temple and on the altar. Not only that, he sacrificed all kinds of animals on the altar. Not only that, he even sacrificed human lives on the altar. The Abomination of Desolation already happened. Parallel passages, look at Luke 21. Luke chapter 21. Same scenario is just being recorded by Luke. Read verse 6 and 7 and verse 32 through 33. Verse 32 says, "Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away." Another parallel passage, Mark chapter 13. Same scenario, Abomination of Desolation being recorded by Mark. Read chapter 1 through Mark 13 verses 1 through 4, and then read verses 30 through 32. Verse 30 says, "Verily I say unto you that this generation shall not pass away till all these things be done. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away." So what is heaven and earth? It's Israel. It's their system. It's Judaism. It's Torah. It has passed away. And it happened in their generation. So that's Abomination Desolation. And I'm waiting for people to go to Revelation and get some third temple and try to stick it in Matthew. That is so unfortunate. That is so unfortunate. When Christ said that this great tribulation, this Abomination Desolation would happen in their generation. Now, if you want to go and hold on to what you've been taught as opposed to what the book is saying to you, that's your prerogative. But and what they always do is they say, well, the reason you think what you think is because you don't have understanding. I can read. I know what this generation is. I know what Ainos is, age, generation, centuries, their generation. The apostles understood what he was saying. That's why when he said the destruction of the temple, that's why they started asking these questions, because they knew what that meant. They knew that they were about to be judged. And that's what happened in AD 70.